"You don't have to hide anymore," Silas whispered, sliding a warm plate across the alley ledge. "Not from me." The girl couldn't have been more than 16, her clothes threadbare, her eyes holding the kind of exhaustion that came from sleeping on concrete. She looked up at the chef standing in the back door of Ember and Oak, his gentle face illuminated by the kitchen's golden glow, and something in her fractured when she saw no judgment there, only kindness. I don't have money," she stammered, her voice small. "I didn't ask for any," Silas replied softly, turning back inside before she could see the moisture in his own eyes. That was how it started, 6 months ago. Silas Brennan, 33 years old, head chef and owner of a modest restaurant in downtown Portland, had found Ivory Matthews shivering behind his dumpster on a rainy October night. Most people would have called the police or looked away. Silas had brought her soup. Now, every night at closing, he prepared an extra meal. Nothing extravagant, he couldn't afford that, but always hot, always nourishing, always served with quiet dignity. He never asked questions. She never offered explanations. It was an unspoken agreement, a small pocket of humanity in an indifferent world. Silas lived alone above the restaurant, in a cramped studio that smelled perpetually of garlic and rosemary. He'd never married, never had children. The kitchen was his family, the customers his purpose. His own childhood had been difficult. A father who left, a mother who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on. He remembered what hunger felt like. He remembered what it meant when someone noticed you were struggling and didn't turn away. Ivory would sit on the metal steps, eating slowly, savoring every bite. Sometimes she'd talk, small things, careful things, how she loved the rain, how she'd once wanted to be a teacher, how she missed her mother's laugh. Silas would listen while wiping down counters, letting the silence between words say what couldn't be spoken aloud. One February evening, his sous chef, Rita, lingered after the others had left. "You know you can't save her, right?" Rita said gently, watching Silas prepare the usual plate. "I'm not trying to save her," his hands steady as he arranged roasted vegetables beside herb-crusted chicken. "I'm just trying to make sure she's not invisible." Rita nodded slowly. She'd worked with Silas for 5 years, knew his heart was bigger than his bank account. "You're a good man, Silas Brennan." "I'm just doing what someone should have done for my mom," he said quietly. What Silas didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Ivory's story was more complicated than he imagined. She wasn't a runaway from an abusive home or a kid aged out of foster care. She was the daughter of billionaire Harrison Matthews, who'd made his fortune in real estate and technology. 6 months ago, after a devastating argument about her mother's recent death and her father's immediate remarriage, Ivory had walked out of their mansion with nothing but the clothes on her back, determined to prove she could survive without his money, without his control. It had been harder than she had imagined. Pride had kept her from going back. Grief had kept her wandering. And shame, deep, cutting shame, had kept her silent about who she really was. But Silas's kindness, night after night, had begun to crack something open inside her. Here was a man who had almost nothing, giving freely. Here was someone who saw her as human, not as a transaction or a disappointment.
One night in early March, she finally spoke the truth. "Silas, I need to tell you something," Ivory said, her voice shaking. "I'm not who you think I am." He paused, setting down his kitchen towel. "Okay." "My father, he's Harrison Matthews. I'm not actually homeless. I mean, I am now, but I wasn't. I ran away, and I've been too stubborn and too broken to go back." Silas was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Then he said something that made her cry for the first time in months. "That doesn't change anything, Ivory. You were still hungry. You still needed someone to see you. Money doesn't make loneliness hurt less." She wept then, really wept, and Silas sat beside her on those metal steps, not touching, just present, bearing witness to her pain the way he'd been doing all along, one meal at a time. 2 weeks later, everything changed. Harrison Matthews walked into Ember and Oak on the Tuesday afternoon. Silas was prepping for dinner service when this impeccably dressed older man approached the counter, his expression unreadable. "Are you Silas Brennan?" "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" "You've been feeding my daughter." Silas's heart stopped. He'd never asked Ivory for her father's name, never pushed for details. Now here stood a man who could destroy his little restaurant with a single phone call, a man whose daughter he'd been sheltering without permission. Yes, sir, I have." Harrison's jaw tightened. "For 6 months I've had private investigators searching for her. 6 months of not knowing if she was alive or dead, and you never thought to contact me?" "She's an adult. It wasn't my place to." "She's my daughter." Harrison's voice cracked, and suddenly Silas saw not a billionaire, but a father, terrified, grieving, desperate. "I know," Silas said softly, "and she needed space to be hurt, to be angry, to figure out who she was without your shadow." The two men stared at each other across the counter, the air thick with tension and unspoken understanding. Finally, Harrison spoke, his voice rough. I told him you never asked for anything, that you just fed her, treated her like she mattered." "She does matter." Harrison's eyes glistened. "I came here to be angry with you, to blame you for not bringing her home sooner. But she says you're the reason she's ready to come home at all, that your kindness reminded her what family should look like." Silas felt his throat tighten. "I'm buying this building. The owner's been trying to sell for months. I'm purchasing it, and I'm making you an offer. Expand Ember and Oak. Make it everything you've dreamed. Let me invest in someone who invested in my daughter when she had nothing." "Mr. Matthews, I don't—" "Please." The word broke from Harrison like a prayer. "Let me do this. Let me say thank you the only way I know how." 3 months later, Ember and Oak reopened in a beautiful renovated space, twice the size, with a full staff and a menu that finally showcased everything Silas had imagined. But the most important thing hadn't changed. Every night, at closing, Silas still prepared extra meals, now distributed to shelters and street corners throughout the city. On opening night, Ivory appeared in the doorway, healthy now, her eyes clear and bright. She'd reconciled with her father, was starting college in the fall, had begun processing her grief in therapy, but she'd asked to be here tonight. She walked to the kitchen window where Silas was plating dishes, and their eyes met.
"Thank you," she said, her voice steady and sure, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for feeding me when I was starving for more than just food." Silas smiled, the same gentle smile from that first rainy night. "You don't have to thank me, Ivory." "Yes, I do," she said firmly, "because you taught me something my father's money never could. You taught me that kindness isn't about what you can afford to give. It's about choosing to give when you have every reason not to. You had almost nothing, and you still shared it." He stepped around the counter, and for the first time, they embraced, not as chef and homeless girl, not as savior and saved, but as two human beings who'd reminded each other that compassion was the currency that mattered most. Harrison watched from across the room, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding what his daughter had been trying to tell him all along. That love wasn't about control or providing or fixing. It was about showing up, night after night, with a warm plate and an open heart. The moral lived in every meal served, every hand extended, every moment someone chose connection over convenience. Kindness doesn't require wealth or power. It requires only the willingness to see another person's hunger, whether for food or understanding or simply being noticed, and to offer what you have, however small. In feeding others, we feed ourselves. In seeing others, we become more fully seen. And sometimes, the smallest acts of compassion ripple outward in ways we cannot imagine, changing not just one life, but every life they touch. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Let's spread more stories of kindness and hope together.